The smell of sterile bleach always makes me want to vomit now. It was 4:15 a.m. when I looked into the eyes of a dead man. And he blinked at me. Torture. That was the Morse code Elias Thorne tapped out with his eyelids, while the transport team waited in the hall to cut out his heart. They told me he was brain dead. They told me the billionaire waiting downstairs had priority. In exactly 45 minutes, the surgical saws will start, and Elias will feel every single Cooper's cut because he isn't dead. He's just being buried alive by a computer program. I'm currently locked in a glass ICU pod, listening to the security team use a battering ram against the door. My medical license is gone. My career is over. And I just found a document proving the doctor who signed the death warrant wasn't even in the building that night. I shouldn't have looked at that chart. Let me take you back to where this began. The sterile scent of ozone and industrial bleach clung to the back of Caleb Miller's throat. A sharp, chemical sting that seemed to coat his tongue. Above bed 402, the surgical lights hummed, a low-frequency drone that vibrated through the thin rubber soles of his clogs and rattled deep in his teeth. Elias Thorne lay beneath a plastic shroud, his skin the color of wet newsprint. A mountain of a man reduced to a collection of failing systems. To the transplant team already gathering their kits in the hallway, Elias was merely a vessel of viable valves and lobes, a biological warehouse waiting to be cleared. To Caleb, watching the man's left eyelid with the intensity of a hawk, he was a telegraph operator sending a frantic, final message. Twitch. Pause. Long twitch. The rhythmic spasms stuttered against the lash line, defying the heavy sedation and the supposed silence of a dead brain. ALIVE. The sequence repeated, a desperate Morse code signal firing from a mind trapped inside a body the world had already written off. Caleb's thumb found the side of his silver stopwatch, the cool metal a grounding weight in his pocket. Click. He timed the intervals. The gaps between the blinks were too deliberate, too structured to be the random firing of dying neurons. He looked at the harvest clock on the wall, its red digital numbers bleeding into the dim light of the ICU. It was ticking toward 0. If the automated system confirmed brain death in the next 60 seconds, the pneumatic restraints would lock, and the process of stripping Elias for parts would become an unstoppable machine. Caleb stepped toward the vitals monitor, his shadow stretching long and jagged over the patient's sunken chest. His pulse hammered against his ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the steady beep, beep, beep of the machines. He knew the protocol. He knew the consequences of interference. But the image of his younger brother at the bottom of that community pool, the blue tint of his lips, the 45 seconds of distraction that had cost a lifetime, surged up in his mind like a drowning ghost. He couldn't let the clock stop again. With a sharp, practiced motion, he reached behind the monitor and pinched the arterial line interface, twisting the plastic casing until the digital readout began to spiral. He forced a kink into the tube, creating a false resistance that the computer would interpret as a catastrophic surge. The steady green line on the screen fractured instantly. A jagged mountain range of crimson spikes surged across the display, screaming of a pressure that would burst a human heart. 180 over 110, 200, 220. The monitor shrieked, a piercing, discordant wail that shattered the ICU's heavy quiet and vibrated the glass walls of the pod. Caleb stepped back, tucking his shaking hands into the pockets of his white coat, his heart a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He had bought Elias time. Not much, but enough to break the harvest cycle. The heavy double doors of the ICU swung open with a pneumatic hiss, and Nurse Jenny Martinez hurried in, her colorful cartoon character scrubs a jarring contrast to the grim tension of the room. She was clutching a tablet to her chest, her eyes wide and darting toward the screaming monitor. "Caleb? What's happening? The central station is lighting up like a Christmas tree, you know?" She leaned in toward him, unconsciously mirroring his rigid, defensive posture. Her voice was thin, wavering with the uncertainty that had defined her since she was a child, ignored in a house of 9 siblings. "The surgical transport team. They're downstairs. They're coming up early. They said the billionaire recipient is already prepped and waiting, right?" Caleb didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the red spikes of the false blood pressure reading. "Hypertensive crisis," he said, his voice sounding hollow and metallic to his own ears. "The sensors are blowing. We can't move a donor in this state. The lungs would oxidize before they hit the cooler." He felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple, a cold itch he didn't dare scratch. The air in the room felt thick, humid with the Chicago heat wave that the hospital's struggling air conditioning couldn't quite beat. It smelled of scorched dust and the metallic tang of blood. "But the schedule," Jenny whispered, her fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the edge of her tablet. "Sterling is going to be furious. He's been pushing for this harvest for 3 days. If we miss the window, the organs degrade, you know. They'll blame us, right?" She looked at the door, her shoulders hunching as if expecting a blow. Caleb finally turned to her, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. He pushed them back with a single, aggressive finger. "Let him be furious." Caleb snapped, the ticking of the stopwatch in his pocket accelerating. "Look at his eyes, Jenny. Look at the eyelid. He's signaling. He's in there." Jenny looked, her breath hitching in her throat as the small, rhythmic twitch of Elias's finger began to match the pulse of the blinking eye. "Oh God," she breathed. "I saw that yesterday. I thought it was just a reflex, like a lizard's tail, you know? But it's a pattern, isn't it?" Before Caleb could respond, the heavy thud of combat boots echoed in the hallway. David Wilson, the lead security guard, rounded the corner, his broad shoulders filling the frame of the doorway. He stood in his typical fortress stance, legs spread wide, arms crossed over a chest that looked like it was carved from granite. He reached up and touched the thin scar on the bridge of his nose, a telltale sign that he was moving from observation to enforcement. "Miller," Wilson rumbled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards. "Step away from the bed. Administration wants this room cleared for the prep team. Now." Caleb didn't move. He felt the Wilson radius, that 4-foot buffer zone the guard maintained like a holy border, closing in on him. "He's unstable, David. Look at the monitor. If you move him now, you're killing a viable donor and wasting a heart." "I don't read monitors, Doc. I read orders," Wilson said, stepping forward. The smell of his cheap peppermint gum and the starch of his uniform hit Caleb like a wall. "And the orders say you're done here. Move or I move you." Caleb's fingers tightened on the edge of the supply cart. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a hot, prickly heat that made the edges of his vision blur. He had spent his whole life watching the clock, waiting for the moment where a few seconds would make the difference between a life saved and a body at the bottom of a pool. He wouldn't look away this time. As Wilson reached out a massive hand to grab his shoulder, Caleb lunged. He didn't think. He simply acted, jamming his shoulder into the guard's chest and using his momentum to shove the larger man back toward the hallway. The scuffle was brief and desperate. Wilson was a wall, but Caleb was a lever. He pinned the guard against a heavy metal supply cart, the wheels screeching against the linoleum floor with a sound like a dying animal. Glass vials of saline rattled and shattered, the smell of salt water filling the air. "Listen to me," Caleb hissed, his face inches from Wilson's. "The chart is wrong. The signatures don't match. Just give me 10 minutes. In the chaos of the scuffle, Caleb's hand darted out and snatched the physical medical folder tucked into the foot of Elias's bed. It was a thick, heavy thing, bound in blue plastic. He felt the weight of it, the physical evidence of a man's life and death. Wilson roared, a sound of pure frustration, and shoved Caleb back. Caleb stumbled, his heels catching on the edge of a rug, but he kept his grip on the folder. He didn't wait for Wilson to recover his footing. He turned and bolted, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm that matched the click, click, click of the stopwatch in his hand. He ran through the sterile corridors, the polished floors acting as a mirror that showed his own terrified reflection sprinting beneath him. The smell of bleach was aggressive here, burning his nose, making him gag as he ducked into a small, dark alcove used for storing extra linens. He collapsed against the wall, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The heat of the building was oppressive, a stagnant weight that made his white coat feel like a lead shroud. With trembling fingers, he opened the blue folder. He flipped past the insurance forms, past the consent for organ donation signed by a grieving sister he hadn't met, and found the initial trauma report. He squinted in the dim light of the storage closet, his eyes scanning the cramped, handwritten notes of the night Elias was brought in. His heart stopped. The signature at the bottom of the intake form was bold and sweeping. Dr. Anthony Aris. Caleb knew Aris. Aris had been at his daughter's wedding in Lake Forest that night. He had seen the photos on the hospital's internal social feed. Aris hadn't been within 50 miles of the ER when Elias Thorne was wheeled in with a crushed skull. Caleb felt a cold shiver run down his spine, despite the 95-degree heat. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a tragedy of timing or a failure of medicine. It was a clerical execution. Someone had pre-signed the death warrant of a man who was still blinking his way back to the light. He closed the folder, the sound of the plastic cover snapping shut, echoing like a gunshot in the small room. He realized then that he was the only one who had seen the gap. The 3-second discrepancy in the digital logs, the rhythmic blinks, the forged signature. They were all threads of a single, ugly tapestry. And he was the only one holding the shears. Caleb? The voice was soft, melodic, and hummed with a deceptive warmth. Caleb froze. He knew that baritone. He knew the scent of expensive sandalwood that preceded the man like a royal herald. He peeked through the slats of the storage door. Dr. Robert Sterling stood in the center of the hallway, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his white shirt crisp and identical to the 46 others in his closet. He was slowly straightening a framed Employee of the Month photo on the wall, ensuring it was perfectly parallel to the floor. He didn't look like a man who had just ordered a murder. He looked like a man who was concerned about the aesthetics of his kingdom. "I know you're nearby, Caleb," Sterling said, his voice echoing off the polished walls. "And I know you have the chart. It was a very spirited performance with Officer Wilson. But we must consider the institutional optics. We have a donor in the observation wing, Mr. Michael Davis, who has given $20 million to this facility. He needs a heart. Elias Thorne no longer needs his. It's a simple matter of resource management." Caleb pressed his back against the cold metal of the linen shelves. He felt the weight of the stopwatch in his pocket. Click. Time was hemorrhaging. He had 50 minutes until the harvest began. 50 minutes to prove that the man in room 402 wasn't a resource, but a resident. Sterling began to walk down the hall, the handkerchief flick audible as he used a silk square to open the door to the ICU. Your obsession with this 3-second digital glitch, Caleb. It's starting to look like a liability. Come out and we can discuss your future. Stay hidden and you won't have one. Caleb waited until the sound of Sterling's footsteps faded, replaced by the low, mournful funeral dirge being hummed by Chief Thompson as he shuffled toward his office. The chief's hum was the signal that the administration was closing ranks. The storm was coming, and Caleb was standing in the middle of a lightning field with a metal rod in his hand. He needed to get back to the bedside. He needed to show the world the jagged spikes of a living mind. But as he looked at the stolen chart, he realized the trap was already closing. By interfering, by stealing the record, by physically assaulting a guard, he had given them everything they needed to bury him along with Elias. The air in the storage room felt thinner now, the smell of bleach and old laundry pressing in on him. He adjusted his glasses, clicked his stopwatch, and stepped out into the light. He had 48 minutes left. The heat in the hospital seemed to intensify as Caleb moved through the back hallways, a humid, stagnant weight that made every breath feel like he was inhaling warm wool. He avoided the main elevators, knowing Wilson and his team would be watching the digital floor indicators. Instead, he slipped into the service stairwell, the concrete steps echoing with the frantic tap, tap, tap of his rubber soles. He was counting the stairs as he climbed, a habit he had picked up from Elias's bedside. 112, 113. He emerged back on the 4th floor, his white coat damp with sweat. He needed to get to the observation gallery, the place where the surgeons and the donor's family could see the truth. The gallery was usually a place of quiet, clinical detachment, a theater of cold necessity. But today, it was a courtroom. Caleb rounded the corner toward the ICU suite and stopped dead. Dr. Sterling was standing in the doorway of room 402, his silver hair catching the flicker of the overhead light. He was talking to a man in a silk robe, Michael Davis. The billionaire donor looked like he owned the air he breathed, his hand rustling a collection of sugar packets in his pocket. The sound was like dry leaves, a reminder of the poverty he had spent a lifetime outrunning. "The donor is perfectly prepared, Mr. Davis," Sterling said, his voice a syrupy, melodic baritone. "We are simply waiting for the final diagnostic cycle to complete. A mere formality. The heart is strong. It will serve you well for another 20 years. Michael Davis rustled his sugar packets. His eyes narrowed as he looked through the glass at Elias Thorne. "And the intern? The one who caused the disruption?" Sterling gave a small, dismissive wave of his silk handkerchief. "A temporary lapse in judgment. Fatigue. We've handled it. He's no longer a concern to the board." Caleb felt a surge of cold fury. He wasn't a concern. He was the only one who had seen the Morse code, the only one who had heard the "I am here" in the silence of a brain-dead room. He stepped forward, his shoes squeaking on the polished floor. "The heart isn't yours yet, Mr. Davis," Caleb said, his voice echoing in the sterile hallway. Sterling and Davis turned as one. Sterling's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened, becoming as cold and flat as a shark's. "Caleb, I thought we had reached an understanding." "We understand that you're committing a clerical execution, Dr. Sterling," Caleb said, stepping into the Wilson radius that David Wilson was currently guarding. "I have the trauma report. Dr. Aris wasn't even here. The signatures are forged, and I have the Morse code. Elias Thorne is alive." Sterling gave a long, dramatic pause, his fingers straightening the edge of his lab coat. Caleb, your imagination is as vivid as your exhaustion. Morse code? From a brain-dead patient? It's a physiological impossibility. A muscle spasm, nothing more. Then let me check the EEG cables, Caleb said, stepping toward the bed. Let me see why the neural activity is being masked. Sterling's smile was thin, a jagged line on a perfectly smooth face. The cables have been inspected by our biomedical team, Caleb. They are perfectly functional. Your interference is now bordering on criminal. Officer Wilson, please escort Dr. Miller to the security office. Wilson stepped forward, his hand touching the scar on his nose. Come on, Doc. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Caleb didn't move. He looked past Wilson, past Sterling, to the bedside equipment. He saw it then, a small, frayed wire near the base of the EEG monitor. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, physical alteration. Someone had taken a pair of surgical scissors and snipped the low-frequency leads, ensuring the machine would never register the slow, deliberate waves of a conscious mind. Look at the cables, Caleb yelled, pointing toward the monitor. They're frayed. Someone cut them. Wilson paused, his eyes darting toward the equipment. Sterling didn't flinch. He simply stepped in front of the monitor, his broad shoulders blocking Caleb's view. The equipment is fine, Caleb. Your delusions are not. Officer, take him. Wilson grabbed Caleb's arm, his grip like a steel vise. Caleb fought back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He managed to twist away, his shoulders slamming into the glass wall of the ICU. The software, the optimization program, it's designed to mask the waves. Check the source code. Sterling's voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper. The software is proprietary, Caleb. It's designed to improve efficiency, not to hide life. You are treading on very thin ice, and the water beneath is quite frigid. Caleb saw his opening. He dove under Wilson's outstretched arm and bolted toward the service elevator. He heard the heavy thud of Wilson's boots behind him, the sound of the guard's radio crackling with a call for backup. He reached the elevator just as the doors were closing and jammed a heavy medical gurney into the gap. The metal screeched as the doors tried to crush it, but the gurney held. Caleb didn't wait. He dove into the maintenance tunnel behind the elevator shaft, the air instantly becoming cooler and smelling of rust and damp concrete. He scrambled down a ladder, his hands stinging as they gripped the cold metal. He was in the bowels of the hospital now, a labyrinth of pipes and wires that groaned under the weight of the building above. He ran through the darkness, his only light the flickering fluorescent bulbs that popped every 4 seconds. He tripped over a discarded junction box and went sprawling onto the wet floor. His hand hit something hard and plastic. He reached out and grabbed it. It was a discarded tablet, its screen cracked but still glowing with a dim, ghostly light. He wiped the grime from the glass and looked at the display. It was the source code for the hospital's optimization software. Caleb's breath hitched in his throat. He wasn't a programmer, but he knew enough to recognize a filter when he saw one. There, buried in the subroutines of the neural monitoring module, was a command to suppress any frequency below 8 Hz. It was a digital murder. The software was literally erasing the signs of life before they could reach the screen. "Oh, God," Caleb whispered, the sound swallowed by the rhythmic drip of water from a rusted pipe. They're not making a mistake. They're making a profit. He looked at the tablet, his mind racing. He had the evidence now. The forged signatures, the frayed cables, the rigged software. But he was trapped in the basement, labeled a criminal, and the harvest was only 30 minutes away. He heard the sound of footsteps above him, the heavy, rhythmic thud of security guards searching the maintenance level. He tucked the tablet into his coat and began to crawl through a narrow ventilation duct, the smell of scorched dust and old grease filling his lungs. He had to get back to the ICU. He had to show the gallery the truth. But as he looked at the flickering light above him, he realized the Wilson radius was expanding. They weren't just looking for him. They were hunting him. The heat in the crawlspace was suffocating, a humid, stagnant air that made Caleb's skin feel like it was being coated in a layer of hot oil. He pushed himself forward, his elbows scraping against the rough metal of the duct. He could hear the low, mournful funeral dirge of Chief Thompson echoing through the vents, a sound that seemed to follow him like a ghost. He emerged into a small storage room on the second floor, his clothes torn and covered in grease. He was shivering despite the heat. He looked at his stopwatch. Click. 22 minutes. He needed a way to bypass the digital mask. He needed something analog, something that didn't rely on the hospital's rigged network. He looked around the storage room, his eyes scanning the shelves of outdated equipment. There, in a dusty corner, was an old handheld diagnostic kit. It was a clunky mechanical thing with analog needles and a paper strip recorder. It was a relic of a bygone era, a piece of technology that didn't know how to lie. Caleb grabbed the kit, his fingers trembling as he checked the batteries. It hummed to life, the small needle on the display jumping as it registered the electrical hum of the room. It was perfect. It was a truth teller in a building full of lies. He slipped out of the storage room and began to make his way back toward the ICU. He moved like a ghost, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the main corridors. He could hear the announcement over the hospital intercom. Sarah Johnson's voice, cold and sharp as a razor. Attention all staff. Dr. Caleb Miller's medical license has been revoked effective immediately. He is considered a threat to patient safety. If you see him, do not approach. Contact security immediately. Caleb felt a surge of cold dread. He was a pariah now, a criminal in the eyes of the institution he had dedicated his life to. But as he looked at the analog kit in his hand, he knew he couldn't stop. He had to prove that Elias Thorne was still there, counting the stairs, waiting for someone to hear him. He reached the ICU pod and saw Sterling standing by the bed, a syringe in his hand. The doctor was preparing to administer the final paralytic agent, the drug that would stop Elias's heart and make the harvest a reality. Caleb didn't hesitate. He burst through the doors, the analog kit held high like a weapon. "Stop, Dr. Sterling, put the syringe down." Sterling turned, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. "Caleb? How did you get back in here?" "I have the truth, Robert," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the hammer of his heart. "I have the source code. I have the analog kit. And I'm not letting you kill this man for a $20 million donation." Sterling's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged toward Caleb, the syringe held like a dagger. Caleb stepped back, his heels catching on the edge of the rug. He felt the sting of the needle as it grazed his arm, but he didn't stop. He swung the heavy analog kit, the metal casing slamming into Sterling's chest. The doctor stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Caleb didn't wait for him to recover. He grabbed the edge of Elias's bed and began to push it toward the reinforced glass pod in the center of the ICU. "What are you doing?" Sterling roared, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm creating a fortress," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He shoved the bed into the pod and slammed the heavy glass doors shut. He heard the pneumatic lock engage, a sound like a guillotine falling. He was trapped inside with Elias, but he was safe. For now. Sarah Johnson appeared on the other side of the glass, her angular features twisted into a mask of cold, bureaucratic perfection. She held up a stack of legal documents, her eyes never blinking. "Dr. Miller, you are committing a felony," she said, her voice echoing through the intercom. "The family has signed the consent forms. The harvest is legally sanctioned. You have no authority here." "The consent was based on a lie, Sarah," Caleb yelled, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "The signatures were forged. The brain death was faked. Look at the monitor." He began to connect the analog kit to Elias's temples, his fingers moving with a frantic, desperate precision. He saw the needle jump. He saw the jagged, undeniable spikes of conscious thought surging across the paper strip. "He's alive!" Caleb screamed, pointing toward the kit. "Look at the spikes. He's in there. He's counting." Outside the glass, the security team arrived with a heavy battering ram. David Wilson stood at the front, his hand touching the scar on his nose. He looked through the glass at Caleb, his eyes full of a strange, guarded sadness. "Miller, open the door," Wilson said, his voice a low vibration. "Don't make us break it down." "I'm not opening it until you look at the kit, David," Caleb yelled. "His daughter's name is Emily, the same as your sister's. Would you let them harvest her?" Wilson froze. His hand dropped from his nose, and he looked at the analog kit. He saw the needle jumping, the rhythmic, deliberate spikes of a living mind. He's alive," Wilson whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the battering ram. The first blow hit the glass with a sound like a thunderclap. The reinforced pane spiderwebbed, 1,000 tiny cracks blooming like frost. Caleb looked at his stopwatch. Click. 3 minutes. He needed to broadcast the signal. He needed the whole world to see. He grabbed the wires from the analog kit and began to strip them with his teeth, the metallic tang of copper filling his mouth. He looked at the room's intercom system, a small recessed panel near the door. He jammed the wires into the intercom's input, creating a raw data patch that bypassed the hospital's rigged network. The second blow hit the glass, and the door began to splinter. Caleb felt the vibration in his chest, a rhythmic, heavy thud that matched the pulse of the blinking eye on the bed. Come on," Caleb whispered, his fingers fumbling with the last wire. The third blow shattered the glass. The door gave way with a roar of splintering wood and twisted metal. David Wilson burst into the room, his hand outstretched to grab Caleb, but it was too late. The patch went live. Across every monitor in the hospital, in the observation gallery, in the ER, in the chief's office, the jagged, undeniable spikes of Elias Thorne's conscious thought surged across the screens. The sound of his brainwaves echoed through the intercom system, a rhythmic, melodic pulse that sounded like a heartbeat. In the observation gallery, Michael Davis stood up, his silk robe fluttering around him. He looked at the monitors, his hand frozen on the sugar packets in his pocket. That isn't a dead brain," Davis whispered, his voice echoing through the gallery. "That's a man." He turned to Sterling, who was standing in the doorway of the ICU, the syringe still clutched in his hand. "The deal is off, Robert. I won't take a heart from a living man, and I won't give another cent to a hospital that murders its patients." The room went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of Elias's finger against the hospital sheet. Caleb collapsed against the wall, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He looked at David Wilson, who was standing over him, his hand still outstretched. "You did it, Doc," Wilson said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. You saved him." Caleb didn't respond. He just closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the analog kit, the rhythmic, melodic pulse of a life that had been saved from the gaps of time. The aftermath was a blur of police sirens and flashing lights. Sterling and Johnson were led away in handcuffs, their faces pale and drawn in the harsh glare of the Chicago sun. Chief Thompson was forced into early retirement, his funeral dirge finally falling silent. Caleb lost his job. His medical license was revoked for his unorthodox methods and his physical assault on a security guard. He was a pariah in the medical community, a man who had broken every rule to save a single life. But as he sat in a sun-drenched park in Chicago weeks later, he didn't feel like a failure. He felt a sense of internal peace that he hadn't known since he was 8 years old. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned and saw Elias Thorne, sitting in a wheelchair, his face pale but his eyes bright and alert. "Thank you, Caleb," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He reached out and squeezed Caleb's hand, a conscious, non-coded gesture of gratitude. Caleb felt the warmth of the man's skin, the physical proof of a life that hadn't been lost in the gaps. Caleb looked at his stopwatch. He clicked it one last time and tucked it into his pocket. He didn't need to count the seconds anymore. He had finally found his way back to the light. The wind whistled through the trees, a constant, high-pitched moan that sounded like a human sob. But as Caleb looked at the empty swing set in the center of the park, he didn't feel lonely. He felt the echo of the old woman's hand on his, the memory of a kindness that had remembered him. He had lost his career. He had lost his reputation. But he hadn't lost himself. And in the end, that was the only measurement that mattered. The sun set over the Chicago skyline, the red light bleeding into the bruised sky. Caleb Miller stood up and began to walk toward the exit, his footsteps rhythmic and steady. He was no longer a human metronome. He was just a man, walking through the light, 1 second at a time,